Okay, last week we started a lesson called Such a High Priest, and it was part 1 of 2. So we're going to finish up part 2 today, which should, Lord willing, finish up chapter 7, but we'll see. The book of Hebrews, as you know, and as I pointed out a number of times, it's a book of contrasts. It's really a story of contrasts. And ever since the first chapter, we've been comparing and contrasting one aspect or another of Jesus against something from the Old Testament, or something from the law, or something from Judaism, to compare and contrast the superiority of Christ. And so that's the same that's true in this section about the high priest, and what he's been really ever since the author introduced the truth that Christ was from a new priestly order, the order of Melchizedek. He's been using that as a springboard to compare Jesus as our great high priest to the Levitical or the human priesthood. So last week, in the first part of this, as you recall, we talked about the contrast in terms of the mortality of the human priests, about how there had been many of the Levitical priests, hundreds, maybe thousands, over the years, because there was this problem with the human high priests. They kept dying. So they continually had to be replaced. There had to be new priests, year after year, because they continually had to be replaced. But the other thing about them is that when there would be a new high priest come along, the qualifications for that new high priest were never about their character or their nature or their previous service or work. Even though those things might have been true in some individual cases, that wasn't what got them the job. What got them the job was genealogy. It was because they were from the tribe of Levi. It was because of who their father was. And also because their line of priests, the Levitical priesthood, were part of the commandment of the law. And that was really the only thing that made him a priest. Contrasting with Christ as our great high priest, because he lives forever, because he conquered death, then his priesthood is eternal. Not only the priesthood is a line, but his particular, you might say, term in office as the great high priest didn't have to be replaced because he lives forever. But also because his becoming high priest had nothing to do with the law. It was because of the sworn oath of God directly. He's making the Messiah a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And that oath that was sworn, that was quoted from Psalm 110, that was made after the law. So it was after and superior to the law. Something new happened. And he's been kind of hinting at that, and he's going to go into this in more detail in the next chapter about the new covenant. But the implication and the hints he's giving is all about something new happened when that happened. So now he's going to continue in the last verses of this chapter with this contrast with Christ as our great high priest versus the Levitical priesthood. Now, whereas last week he was talking about the contrast in mortality and the methodology of becoming priest, in this section he's going to talk about his character. So he begins this section, or today's lesson, verse 26. What introduces us to this idea is that here the author actually answers what I called the rhetorical question from earlier in the chapter. Verse 26 says, "Such a high priest meets our need." If you remember back to verse 11 from several weeks ago, I began that lesson with the author giving us basically a rhetorical question. He said, if perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, why was there still a need for another priest to come? Well, here he sort of answers that question. So I guess really I lied to you. It wasn't really a rhetorical question. It was just a delayed answer. Because here's the answer. The reason that there was still a need, but here we have the answer. There is a high priest who does meet the need. He identified the one that does meet that need and answers the question, Jesus Christ. So he goes on in the answer to that. He doesn't just say this is the answer. He explains why this is the answer. And that's what we see in the rest of verse 26. One who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. That's all. No big deal, right? So let's kind of dive into that, into those descriptions. First of all, one who is holy. Now, usually when we see this word in the New Testament, we tend to think that this comes from that Greek word hagios, which means separate or apart. This particular one is another Greek word, hosios, and it means essentially religiously right. It means holy in the sense that we tend to think of holy in English. Religiously a right or moral person, not as in not polluted or defiled in any way. The point is that Jesus was not defiled by sin. He lived in the flesh. He was a real flesh and blood man, and he was tempted just like we were. He did suffer the temptations to sin, but he never was defiled by sin. He was never polluted by sin. He retained his holy nature as God, the Son. Secondly, he calls him blameless. The word there is akekos, and this is another one of those words where the root means one thing, and in the Greek they put the a prefix in front of it, which means negation, or like putting not. The root word kakos means bad, is what it basically means. It means bad. And it means bad in an intrinsic sort of way. In other words, because there are some things that in and of themselves aren't bad, but they can be used in a bad way. Well, this word means something that's just intrinsically bad or harmful. It can also mean bad in a harmful way, like, thinking in modern terms, like thinking of like radiation. It's intrinsically harmful. So it says Jesus then is not that, because it has the not or the in front of it. And the King James Version translates it as harmless. So Jesus intrinsically, that is by his nature, he's of great worth. He's the opposite of bad or harmful. The effect of his work in our life then, instead of being something that tears us down, is something that builds us up. It's something that is useful or beneficial or building up to our spiritual lives, as opposed to something that tears us down. So he's blameless. And then he goes on to say that he's pure, and that word means, undefiled or unsoiled. And so this kind of explains why or how he's holy. It's almost like it's almost a synonym with that word in the Greek. It explains why he's holy. He's righteous because he's undefiled and pure. And then this next phrase, this is interesting. I like it. Set apart from sinners. This is the spiritual version of social distancing. That's essentially what it means. It means distancing from someone, being at a safe distance. So that's what it is. It's social distancing, but in this case it's spiritual. He's set apart from sinners. And so he doesn't mean set apart from sinners in the sense that he can't interrelate to us. He's not talking about the fact that, the Bible tells us that Jesus is a friend to sinners and that our relationship with him means, we have a union with him. What he's talking about here, he's set apart in the sense that he's not defiled by, despite being the friend of sinners, he's not defiled by sinners. He's not affected by sinners. And so, because of that spiritual social distancing, the virus can't make it across the 6 feet,
The column of air.
Huh?
The column of air.
The column, yes, exactly, thank you. The column of spiritual air there. So he's emphasizing that the pollution of our nature as fallen man cannot reach him. So he's spiritually distanced from sinners in that sense. And then he's exalted above the heavens, and this word just means lofty and elevated. And so this is talking about not only his spiritual character is higher than any human priest could be, but I think this also gets back to his divine nature and his royal nature as the King of Kings. Because, again, he's not just priest, but he is also king. which was one of the reasons why God used Melchizedek to be the picture of the Christly priesthood. Because remember, Melchizedek, it said, was a priest and a king, which was very unusual for the time, for there to be someone who was a king but also served as a priest. So I think this exalted above the heavens speaks back to that idea of his divine and royal position, which was something that the Levitical priesthood didn't have. You know, they had a lot of spiritual authority to guide the people's worship and their sacrifices and their adherence to the law, but they weren't over the people in the sense of like a king would be. In fact, originally there wasn't even a king at that time, because the original theocracy was not a king. That was something the people wanted, remember? And I don't want to go into that rabbit trail, but you know, that was not God's original plan for there to even be a king of Israel. He had a different form of government, if you will, in mind. But that was something the people wanted. But anyway, this speaks, though, again, of the fact that he is the priest and the king. And also, these phrases describing him as holy, blameless, and pure, set apart from sinners, this is essentially the fulfillment of the picture that's given to us back in Leviticus, where God commanded, when he was describing the animals that would have to be brought in for the sacrifices, he commanded that the animals used for the sin offering had to be without defect. And that was intended as a picture of the purity of Christ as the ultimate sacrifice. That he, in a spiritual sense, was without defect, holy, blameless, pure. So that's what the purity or the without defect picture of the animals that were brought for the sin offering in the Levitical times represented this. So by saying that Jesus met all of these spiritual and moral qualifications, it was saying that he could be the sacrifice that could be offered without defect. So it fulfilled that promise. Now, again, we're talking about a contrast here. So after describing the nature of Jesus, the next word out of his mouth is unlike, pointing out that it's a distinct contrast and difference from the other high priests. And when he says the other high priests, of course, he's talking about the Levitical priesthood, the human high priest. His nature of purity and holiness and his exalted nature contrasts completely with the human Levitical priesthood. Everything Jesus was, they were not. He was eternal, they were not. He was holy, they were not. He was pure and undefiled, they were not. He was everything they could not be. Therefore, he could do everything they could not do, which is why he could meet the need from verse 11. So, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day. The atoning work that the human priests could not accomplish, they couldn't accomplish the task to the uttermost, that is, to the end, to the completion. Because what they did was limited. It had to be repeated day after day and year after year. And the reason is because what they did really didn't atone for sins. It only was a picture, a representation of what really would atone for sins. I'll give you a modern analogy that's kind of in reverse, but I think it gives the picture of what I'm trying to say. Every year on July the 4th, we celebrate Independence Day. And we are commemorating, of course, the independence, of the United States. And when we do, one of the things that we do is we go out there and we shoot fireworks and light sparklers and we do all that kind of stuff. Well, when we're shooting fireworks, what are we doing? What does the fireworks represent when we shoot off bottle rockets and stuff?
Would it be like a Like the rocket's red glare. Like
Yeah,
the,
yeah. I mean, essentially, when we're firing the fireworks, it's representing sort of the great battles
battle
and
between the
Yeah.
British.
right. Like you said, the rocket's red glare.
Yeah.
So when we shoot off those rockets, we're not really fighting a war. We're not really fighting, against the British again. We're not really winning a battle. It's just a picture of something that happened a long time ago that we're commemorating, okay? Well, the atoning work of the great high priest was kind of the same way, except it was being done ahead of time. When they went and sacrificed the animals and sprinkled the blood on the mercy seat of the day of the Ark of the Covenant, that wasn't really taking away the sins. That was kind of like the bottle rockets on the 4th of July. It was a picture of something that really happened 200 and something years ago that was really effectual. What they did, in the battles of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, those were the real things that really won our independence. Those were real cannons and real guns and real blood being shed and real people dying and real battles being won that really won our freedom. But what we do on 4th of July is just a picture of that. It represents that. Well, in reverse, that's the point of the Day of Atonement and the sacrifices that the Levitical priests did. They were a picture of something, but they weren't what would actually do the work. What they did could not actually atone for sins. It could only represent the atonement. And the real atonement was what they pointed to, which was the shed blood of Christ. So what they did was limited. It could not accomplish the task. Now, it goes into also part of demonstrating why that limitation was, why their sacrifice could not actually accomplish the goal. Because talking about the other high priests, before they could even do their work, it says first they had to offer for their own sins. Just for a moment, I want to turn back, and you don't have to turn here because I'll just read it for you, but Leviticus 16 talks about when Aaron would go in to do the priestly work. And it starts in verse 3 of Leviticus 16, and it says, "This is how Aaron is to enter the sanctuary area, with a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He's to put on the sacred linen tunic with linen undergarments next to his body. He is to tie the linen sash around him and put on the linen turban. These are the sacred garments. So he must bathe himself with water before he puts them on. From the Israelite community, he is to take 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram for the burnt offering." Verse 6, "Aaron is to offer the bull for his own sin offering, to make atonement for himself and his household." So before Aaron, and of course this also applied to his successors as great high priest, before he could actually do the work of the high priest, he had to go through this intense cleansing ritual before he could even begin the sacrifice. And then he had to offer a bull for his own sin offering before he could do anything for the people. And so thusly, all of his descendants who became priests after him, verse 32 of chapter 16 of Leviticus tells us that all the other high priests were his successors. They had to do the same thing. They all had to go through that cleansing ritual and first had to offer for their own sins. Because they were men, they were sinners themselves. They needed the atonement just as much as the people did. So they could not approach God on their own merit. Something had to enable them to stand before God, or else they would surely die in the presence of holy God. We've talked about that before, but this is where that's first mentioned, back in Leviticus 16. Verse 13 says, this is Aaron, he is to put the incense on the fire before the Lord, and the smoke of the incense will conceal the atonement cover above the testimony, so that he will not die. So Aaron's life was at risk standing before God in his own righteousness, in his own ability, and in his own nature. So then they would offer for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people. Only after their own atonement could they work, to atone for the sins of the rest of the people, which is which begins in verse 15 of Leviticus 16. But even then, as I've pointed out, that was only a picture. It was incomplete and utterly powerless symbol of what Christ one day would do. So, the last part of verse 27 tells us about the finality of his work. He says, unlike other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He that is the great high priest, Jesus, he sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. So the he sacrificed for their sins refers back to such a high priest, that is Jesus. He didn't have to do that first part Aaron had to do, to cleanse himself and put those garments on and then to atone for himself. He did not have to sacrifice for himself because he was holy, pure, blameless, without defect. What he did was only for us. What he did was only for the people's sins. And he didn't have to keep doing it day after day, year after year. It was once for all. The Greek word there, ephapex, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it simply means one single time, upon one occasion only. Rather than day after day, his sacrifice only needed to happen once. Once done, it's done. Once done, its power and purpose was complete to the uttermost. He did not have to be repeated. And what he offered was not the blood of bulls and goats. What he offered was himself, which we've already established was holy, pure, blameless, without defect. He offered himself. He didn't offer sacrifices like the Levites. He sacrificed his own holy, pure, undefiled, eternal life as the atonement for the people's sins. This is why and how his priestly work was so powerful. The sacrifice he offered was not the blood of animals, but his own holy, precious blood, undefiled blood. So now he ends this chapter with one final comparison, and that is the nature of the two appointments to the priesthood. Verse 28, for the law appoints as high priests men who are weak. This is kind of a summary statement here, which makes sense that it's why they put a chapter end here, because this is kind of a summary of what he said before. Because he's already talked about how the difference in how the high priest became priest in the law versus Christ. So this is the summary. But once again, he's contrasting the way each priestly order came into being. One came by the Mosaic law. The law appointed the Levitical high priests. And it made the priests from a group who were not priestly by nature. There was nothing in the nature or the character by definition of the tribe of Levi that made them worthy of being priests. It was just because God said, that's going to be where the priests are from. They were men who were weak. These priests were just men, infirm and weak. They were polluted by sin themselves, and that's why they had to do sacrifices for themselves first, because they were powerless to really solve man's sin problem, because they also suffered from it. By contrast, he says, but the oath which came after the law appointed the Son, who has been made perfect forever. So the priestly order that Christ came from, that of Melchizedek, came by direct oath of God. And again, that was recorded in Psalm 110:4. The Lord has sworn. And he was pointing out and emphasizing this came after the law. The Psalms were written after the law was already given. The oath that God made in Psalm 110:4 was not part of the Mosaic law. It was something new. That's what in verse 12 he was pointing out, that something changed. Something new happened at that point. Something replaced the law. Something superseded the law. And so he appointed the Son, that is not a created man, but the oath of God appointed his one and only Son, God the Son. The Word was made flesh. And him to be the great high priest. Yeah.
So the King James Version uses the word consecrated here instead of made perfect.
Yes.
Is there a root word that kind of means both here in the Greek, or?
Well, that's you probably can't read it because it's in microprint here, but that word there, made, the priest has been made forever, is teleo, which is a form of that Greek word telos that we've talked about many times that means complete or accomplished everything that it needed to accomplish.
Okay.
Okay? So this is one case where I think the NIV is probably, I point out if the King James is more accurate, and sometimes it is. This is the case where I think the NIV is more accurate because the word does mean, the root Greek word does mean to actually accomplish or fulfill something or bring something to its end. Not end in a chronological sense, but end in accomplishing what it needs to do.
Right. Whereas consecrate just means to
Consecrate means more like to separate something for holy use.
Yeah.
That's not untrue in his case, of course, but I don't think that's what this word really means. So I'm not sure why they really chose that word. But he's been made perfect forever means that he completed, he answered the need. He met the need. He did what the high priests of Leviticus could not do, which was to truly wipe away the penalty for our sins. And he atoned for the sin and made us holy because of his holiness and because of the purity and undefiled nature of his blood, so that we can approach God through him. So that the separation, where we were separated from God because of our sin, he could bridge that gap because he could do what the Levitical priests could not do and actually atone for the sins. He was what they represented. His sacrifice was what the blood of bulls and goats was a picture of. Whereas they were just the bottle rockets, he was the actual victory in battle, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
The reality that they picture. So, that ends chapter 7. And when we go now into chapter 8, he's going to continue on in this discussion of the priesthood. But what he's going to do now is expound on what he hinted at early in the chapter when he talked about how the law has been superseded, something new has happened. In chapter 8, he's going to begin to talk about the new covenant. And this is theologically and historically very, very significant. Because in the history of theology, when we talk about the covenants, there was and I don't want to go into too much detail today because we'll talk about it when we get to that point, but there was the Abrahamic covenant where God made a covenant with Abraham. There was the Mosaic covenant that was specific to the land. There was the Davidic covenant that he made with David that was specific to the royal line, the king, and so forth. And then in Jeremiah 31 was introduced the new covenant. And the new covenant which is developed here, is essentially what superseded the law, and that is the new covenant in Christ. So from the theological history of covenants, the new covenant is very significant because it's the culmination, essentially, of part of the Abrahamic covenant. Because remember, part of the Abrahamic covenant was that all of the nations of the earth would be blessed through you. That was, of course, the Messiah that he was talking about. The new covenant is the fulfillment of that. So even though it's a new covenant, in a way it's a fulfillment of the first covenant, the Abrahamic covenant. So, anybody have any questions?
More of kind of two observations that I think about, because I'm very visual when you hit on the cleansing periods.
Right.
I thought about what a bloody mess that must have been. I mean, we
yes.
think of cleansing, but I'm thinking of all this blood from a murdered bull and
that's because that's no small thing.
See, and sprinkling this all around. I wonder who cleans that after the cleansing, and does it stay in the tent? Does all that sprinkled blood just stay there? And how much must that
Well, you
smell?
remember, if you remember, there were always the lavers, that is, they were bowls that would catch the blood.
Yeah.
But of course, as you know, there's gonna be blood splatter too, so yeah, there's gonna be blood everywhere.
Well, I mean, whoa.
But you're right, that had to all be cleaned up, you know, so
That's
you're,
not even the servant's heart.
right.
Oh, gosh.
Stack chairs.
So then my second thing has nothing to do with that. It's more on the political note of when God first allowed men to have kings, and you're saying that it wasn't his plan. Well, man started all that politics mess. It was
Yeah, they
started
sure
way back
did.
there with the first king.
They sure did.
You would have the people that were for the king, the people that were against the king that was either good or
Good or
bad.
bad, and then what would happen, and then the king would influence the people.
And it's on till now. It's still going to now. And it'll
You're right.
go until the end of time, until God, you know, sets up his perfect
And that's-
new
and
earth
it's-
and new heaven.
It's not the point of this message, but it is a good point that the whole thing of, you know, a king leading God's people, you're right, it was not so much his idea as our idea.
Which is why it doesn't work.
Which is why it doesn't work, you know. Remember, they were all saying, oh, we want a king like the other nations. And he's like, you don't need a king, you have me. You don't need a king. You have me. But you want a king? You're gonna get a king. And be careful what you ask for.
But like even then, like theocracies throughout the like actual theocracies throughout history, a lot of times don't even really work as well because still in control is like a high priest that is man.
Yeah, as long as man is in control, it's never gonna go right.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. So yes, those are all good and interesting points, so.